I'm currently reading a debate book between William Lane Craig and Sinnott Armstrong. Craig is, of course, up with the Kalam cosmological argument on the premise everything that begins to exist has a cause. However, Sinnott Armstrong claims that one interpretation of quantum physics says that particles can in fact come out of nothing. If that is the case, could the universe have popped out of nothing? Before we get into the answer to this question, it might be helpful for most of us to understand what exactly this question asker is getting at. The first thing that we have to understand is what argument are they talking about? Now, it is going to sound very high and mighty to say the Kalam cosmological argument that was being argued over here, but that probably doesn't mean anything to most people. It's actually an argument that is, I think, fairly straightforward to understand. And the person who is challenging the position of this argument is saying that its premises, or the things in which we build an argument out of, one or more of those premises is flawed. To give you a quick summary of what exactly is being argued here, the cosmological argument is an argument in which, and it's an old one, in which if everything in the universe has to have a cause of some sort, if there is always a cause behind the things that we see in the universe, then the universe itself is caused by something or someone. In the way that William Lane Craig, who by the way is a noted Christian philosopher, is employing this particular argument, what Lane Craig is saying is that the universe has a cause outside of its own self because everything in the universe has a cause. The person who is debating with Craig on this is saying that given what we actually have discovered in quantum physics, there seem to be particles that arise out of nothing. In quantum physics, there is an aspect in which there is generation of certain particles that arise from seemingly nowhere. And given that this is the case, Sinnott Armstrong is arguing against this cosmological argument by saying that the premise that everything has a cause is false. And that it need not be that everything has a cause, but rather things can randomly appear. Now, to not get into much of the fine points of this argument, the question asker is basically getting at, why does it need to be that God caused the universe, or that this entity called God even has to exist for the universe to exist? Well, it gets back to what John Polkinghorne is going to say, is that every fact is an interpreted fact. And the problem with jumping to too easy a conclusion that, well, the premise that everything has a cause must simply be false. Rather, once again, John Polkinghorne says, especially as it comes to particle physics, of which he particularly is an expert in this, we have to be a little bit more careful in jumping to conclusion that we don't actually have established as what we would say unmitigated fact yet. Rather, he tries to explain why the arguments are going on and what exactly is meant by the argument from particle physics that particles just come out of nowhere. First of all, Polkinghorne is going to say that's not entirely how that happens. In quantum physics, there is an aspect in which we do see particles arise seemingly at random. However, the problem with that is that it is not entirely true to say that we simply say they come out of nowhere. Rather, they come from interactions between the universe that are simply not explained. We don't have an explanation for what exactly is going on. And he puts a little note in saying that it's not really that they arise out of nothing, but rather they arise out of what some physicists call the quantum foam, which is a great word there. But the quantum foam is more of a state of reality in quantum physics in which there are strings of energy that are tying everything that we see together that arise some particular particles from this background noise, so to speak. And so it's not necessarily that they come from nowhere, they just come from a process that we have no explanation for. But that doesn't need to scare us off from understanding that the universe could potentially be caused or come out of nowhere and still hold that God is involved in the universe somehow. Because as Polkinghorne goes on to talk about, there are things within the universe that we hold fairly strongly to mathematically that we have no explanation for. One of the things is that the physical universe, at least from a particle physicist's perspective, is made up of maybe somewhere between 4 and 5% of the actual physical observable stuff we see, and a significant, if not majority portion of the universe is made up of dark matter and energy that we have no explanation for and we know very, very, very little about. But it doesn't, once again, mean that those things don't exist. It just means that we have no explanation for it. Now, he brings up another example that might be completely obtuse to those who are watching, but I want to explain what he means by this. He talks about, in the answer to this question, that there is no big theory of everything that reconciles general relativity with quantum physics. Now, this is mathematicians speak for the science of the very big and the science of the very small. There is a very interesting thing that's going on in which there are explanations that are reliable for certain kinds of physics, the physics of the quantum very small, the physics of the very big general relativity, except that the mathematical principles that work for the really small stuff do not work for the really big stuff. And the stuff that works for the really big stuff does not work for the really small stuff. Seemingly paradoxically, they work for certain particular applications, but not in the big sense. Like we would assume that mathematics would be perhaps non-biased in the ways in which it is applied. And of course, we believe that true logical mathematics is not something that has to necessarily have bias within it. However, there is an interesting question as to why certain mathematical principles between these science of really small and science of really big don't work. And that means that, because of course nature abhors a vacuum, that means that there is some sort of principle out there that is perhaps undiscovered, that connects these dots somehow, that we simply have not formulated or have not discovered evidence to be able to put together the big picture. It's sort of like having two parts of a big puzzle put together, but not having the connecting pieces between them yet. It's not that either one of these are not part of the big picture of truth, it's just that we haven't yet discovered or haven't yet quite put together how the rest of these things touch each other, if that makes sense. All that to say is that it's not that there are certain principles that now we know things don't work how we think that they should. It's more that we have principles that we can still argue over their import. There's no hard and fast proof that the arising of particles out of this quantum foam is proof that things don't have a necessary or efficient cause. In other words, the way that you could read the cosmological argument, of which Polkinghorne is bringing up, is that you could read the cosmological argument in its particular premises as including the possibilities of all three conclusions, that either the universe is caused, the universe is arising out of nothing, or the universe has some sort of self-cause. You could read all three of these things into that particular argument. But again, theists and atheists can employ these things based upon interpreted fact for these probability arguments that are not hard and fast logically true or false, but rather they have the probability of being true or false given what our kind of background beliefs are coming to this. It's not that, as perhaps the question asker might say, it's not that there's a hard and fast rule saying that the universe could have popped out of nothing or could have been caused by something exterior, but rather that there is a significantly more complex relationship between the mathematical facts and the interpretation of those facts in the ways in which we argue about whether the universe is causative or not. Obviously, Polkinghorne, coming from the theistic point of view, is going to say that the universe was caused by God. And using this cosmological argument can argue for that. But what Polkinghorne wants to say is be careful about saying that this is proof that God caused the universe, because there are interpreted facts applied in here that also need to be nuanced. The quantum foam particular way is that perhaps the universe is still an avenue in which God acts within the universe, but perhaps we can't hard and fast say that God caused the universe in the way in which we think of causation. There is a bigger causative background to the ways that we can think about the universe in the mathematical sense that is part of the big picture, but may not necessarily be the same way that we sometimes think about it. How can we say that in the beginning there was nothing and then there was something when there was nothing from which that something could come from? It seems impossible for the Big Bang to happen without the aid of God. There was not even the potential for the Big Bang before it was said to be made actual. It was simply a logically impossible supposition that something can explode out of nothing. Nicholas Beale speaks first before Polkinghorne about this particular question of, well, how can you possibly hold that the universe had no cause, or the universe had no exterior cause if basically something came out of nothing? And part of the background to this question is that in science, there are various presuppositions that are held by scientists whenever we discuss how the mechanics of the what are happening, and how can we say that the Big Bang, the rapid expansion of the universe, is something that not only is a good hypothesis, but is actually a very well-established theory by now. A quick note. Theory is not the same thing as, well, this sounds like a good idea. There is a common turn of phrase that is, well, that's good in theory, but not in practice. Well, it's not exactly what scientists are meaning by theory. Theory in the scientific sense is an established fact based upon many, many different avenues of research in which we can reliably say there is something to it. Hypotheses are testing of certain ideas or certain explanations that don't have the sort of backing that a theory has. It's sort of like saying that I have a certain opinion about something, and then turning around and saying that there is a factual analysis of something. My opinion is based upon my own sort of interpretation of something, but whenever I'm appealing to a fact about something, I'm appealing to something that can be testable, that is rigorous, that for many, many different sorts of data points is reliable. So when we talk about the theory of the Big Bang, this is something that has been established as a firm foundation to start from that has a lot of evidence that is going into this as being an established interpreted fact about the universe. And so to rewind, the Big Bang was a significant problem for atheists whenever it came to particularly the doctrine of creation. As we talked about in previous chapters, it used to be the case that there was a widespread assumption that the universe was static, that there was simply a static universe, the universe has always existed, and this was, again, not based upon a wide body of evidence. It was based upon an interpreted body of evidence. But whenever that body of evidence in the cosmological sense, in the big general relativity sense, especially since Einstein, when that particular hypothesis about the universe began to receive some criticisms based upon what we were finding scientifically, such as the redshift, it seems that things are moving farther away from each other, and that there are other things such as the cosmic background radiation, there is some sort of some residual radiation from something that was a lot bigger and more concentrated in previous millennia. But there was a building body of evidence that there was something else about the architecture of the universe that happened that instead pointed towards a rapid expansion of the universe from a seemingly minuscule point. All of that particular scientific gobbledygook that I just told you that's very interesting to me, the main point of all of this is that the scientific community has established theory that the universe did not just exist in perpetuity, but rather that it came out and it expanded from a particular point in time. The reason why that is perhaps a little bit tenuous for someone who is arguing from an atheistic position is that that seems to strongly suggest the universe had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning, that strongly seems to suggest that there were causative motions or causative preconditions that predispose this thing happening not simply by itself. There are all kinds of theories from pre-Big Bang cosmology that try to explain why the universe could be causative of itself. And there certainly could be cases in which we could say, well, this thing was just a happy accident. The thing is that Beale points out that actually seems to have less explanatory power than to say there was someone who started the whole process to begin with. Polkinghorne, again, wants to come back to the point that the universe is, as he says, not a free lunch. The universe did not give itself its own existence, but rather because of the ways in which we actually can test and see the ways in which these reliable theories are acting, we can say for relative certainty that there was a beginning point of the universe. Now, how you interpret that fact is going to be different depending on if you're a theist or atheist, but as Polkinghorne says, the way that the theist interprets that fact is that God is the precondition upon which the universe had its beginning. And at least in the ways that theists can talk about the Big Bang, theists can say, for relatively strong convictions, that God is, in fact, that precondition that predisposes the universe to rapid expansion. It's the same sort of precondition that the atheist will take in saying that, well, there's no outside causative force other than the intracausative forces of the universe that cause that rapid expansion. We simply don't know the preconditions yet. Which is another way of saying that the universe did cause itself, we just don't know exactly how that happened right now. That itself is a faith-based position. That itself is a leap of faith. The same sort of leap of faith that it is to say that there is an exterior intelligence that created the universe as it is. Polkinghorne basically wants to say it's basically the chicken or the egg in this case. The question that we are asking is not one that is rapidly different from each other, which there is a scientific explanation for this, and there is a theistic explanation for this. There is a science over here, religious over here. Rather, what Polkinghorne is saying is that it's all the same thing. There are preconditioned interpreted facts from our own positions that we are interpreting into these vacuums of explanation. And it's no better or worse to say that the atheistic or theistic position has any particular ground within certain humanities discussions or scientific discussions. That is not the point. Rather, it's more appropriate to say that both are attempts to explain what we see within the actual science itself. I'm continually hearing that the fact that the subatomic world is random shows that God did not create it. My question is, what effect would a structured or organized subatomic world have on creation? As water has unique properties that are necessary, could it be that a random subatomic world is what makes creation possible? If we have observable phenomena that we're able to see, or at least mathematically describe, that seem to have no overarching structure whatsoever. There is randomness in this. Is that an evidence that God simply does not exist? God simply could not have created this. Or if God did create pure randomness, what does that say about God's own character? This is a good charge against the idea that, well, when we have certain phenomena, we can't say that everything is ordered, can we? The thing that Nicholas Beale and Polkinghorne want to point out first is that when we use the word random, what are we meaning? Philosophically, it's a little bit of a slippery term. When we're saying random, we can mean anything from it doesn't behave the way that I think it should, to it doesn't behave in any particular way at all. It is substantially different to say that this doesn't behave the way that I think it should, and this doesn't behave in any explainable way. But when we think about what they're trying to get at, this idea that there is a fundamental randomness to the quantum realm that we are looking at, this of course gets into some really heavy mathematics that are not exactly going to be appealing to anyone to hear the answers to, and most certainly are going to be very opaque. What the main point is being gotten at here is, if God created a world that acts completely chaotically and randomly, how can we say that God really did create it in the first place, and not a better explanation would be that the universe simply arises randomly and chaotically? This actually gets back, very interestingly, to the concept of God and his infinite knowledge, omnipotence, and so on and so forth, creating the universe with an aspect of free will in it. The question of free will and determinism, is everything determined to happen a certain way, or are things free to happen as the coins fall, so to speak? Polkinghorne has a very interesting note on here that I think is very important, which is that scientists like Polkinghorne and Beale can see that the universe exists, as he would say, on the knife edge of structure and freedom. In the way in which that functions, there is an unpredictability that we've talked about before, but that is more closely associated with something called chaos theory, in that when we observe things about the quantum physics that we are observing by mathematics, we can say that there is a built-in uncertainty or a built-in chaoticness that is simply unpredictable. However, we can also say, paradoxically, at the same time about quantum physics, that it is not what we would say completely random. There are ways in which we can predict certain things about the quantum realm. This goes back to a particular theory that you might have heard before called the Heisenberg uncertainty theory. And the reason why this is an important theory is because there are certain ways in which matter operates that we can know certain things about it at one point in time, but not other pieces of information at the same time that we know this information. Explaining this, let me talk about subatomic physics. When we talk about where an electron is, an electron, of course, is that little negative charge that is circling, quote-unquote, circling around an atom. It doesn't really circle. That's simply the way that we can best describe it in ways that we can understand. But that little electric charge, that negative electric charge that is really tiny, we don't know, and this is what the Heisenberg uncertainty theory tells us, we can not know its position at the same time that we know its vector. We can know how fast it's going, but not its direction, and we can know its position, but not its direction. We cannot know both of these things at the same time. We can never know, at least at the current way that we talk about physics, we cannot know both an electron's position and its direction at the same time. We can only know one of these things. So it's not that we can't know something about the subatomic particles and the interactions of these subatomic particles. It's just that we can't know the whole picture at the same time with the ways in which we currently understand the physical universe functioning. It can be that there are some mysterious phenomena that we don't have some pure explanations to. And in that is an interesting point. We can treat this as either an interpreted fact that the world is simply random, that there is no explanation for this. Or we can take the particular sort of approach that Polkinghorne takes, which is that, no, there are things that we can solidly know about these things that are not purely undetermined, but rather we cannot simply determine or understand the whole concept. There is certainly an aspect of indeterminacy, an aspect that we can't purely and perfectly predict everything within the universe. And there is an aspect that tells us that we can actually never expect to be able to purely and perfectly predict everything in the universe, because there is seemingly, to use even the more kind of humanistic ways of talking about this, there seems to be an interesting set of free will, if we can talk about that as some sort of metaphor, to actual subatomic particles itself. There seems to be a free will to self-determine even in non-human things. And Polkinghorne says that is not evidence for randomness, that is not evidence for non-explanations. Polkinghorne basically says that is the actual physical explanation of the outcome of a creator that creates a universe that has the free will to self-determine. That's something that Polkinghorne, again, in differentiation to perhaps some Christians who would say that the universe created by God simply is determined. There is a predestined sort of, in the big capital sense, determined way that the universe functions. There are Christians who argue for that, but Polkinghorne, as a Christian, says that actually the way in which he understands the universe functioning actually is evidential of the universe having a built-in free will that is not merely a human trait, but is rather a trait that the universe is imbued by her creator. Fascinating stuff that Polkinghorne points towards. But the point about this is that, first of all, we have to say that the universe is simply random or merely random is an interpreted fact based upon a certain position. And it is using established scientific fact to argue for a particular interpretation of that fact. Polkinghorne, of his own faith-based jump on this in the theistic realm, is going to say that from his particular perspective, this interpreted fact can be established as cause for how God imbues the universe with free will on the very basic levels of quantum mechanics. We can argue for both of these from a probabilistic sense, but Polkinghorne wants to simply open the door and say we can absolutely make an argument in the theistic realm for this as an actual fact about the physical universe.